What if everything you thought you knew about your family was wrong? Imagine growing up believing one story about who your father was, only to discover decades later that the truth was something entirely different. That was the reality for actor Sean Astin, the beloved star of the Goonies, Stranger Things, and of course, Samwise Gamgee in The Lord of the Rings. To the world, he seemed to have it all figured out. A steady career, a grounded personality, and the rare ability to navigate Hollywood without being swallowed by it. But behind that calm exterior was a question that haunted him for most of his life. Who was his real father? The answer wasn't simple, because his mother, Patty Duke, was no ordinary woman. She was America's sweetheart, a child star who captured hearts on The Patty Duke Show and made history as the youngest Oscar winner of her time. Yet behind the lights and applause, Patty's life was chaos. Her struggles with mental health, whirlwind romances, and impulsive decisions all collided at the exact moment Sean was born, leaving a trail of confusion that would stretch across decades. 3 men, 3 possible fathers, one Hollywood mystery that no one could untangle, not even Patty herself. It would take years, a DNA test, and a shocking twist no one expected to finally reveal the truth. Patty Duke's story didn't begin in the tabloids or on the big screen. It began with a little girl thrust into the spotlight before she ever had the chance to figure out who she really was. Born on a Marie Duke in Queens, New York, she was just a child when she was introduced to acting. By 8 years old, she was already appearing in television commercials and minor roles, but it wasn't long before Hollywood realized she had something rare. Unlike many child actors, Patty wasn't just cute, she was gifted. Her raw emotion, ability to memorize lines, and instinctive performance skills set her apart immediately. By her early teens, she was being recognized as one of the most promising young actresses in America. Her big breakthrough came in 1962 when she starred as Helen Keller in The Miracle Worker. The film was an instant success, and Patty's performance stunned audiences. At only 16 years old, she won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress, making history as the youngest Oscar winner at the time in that category. Imagine being barely old enough to drive a car, and instead you're standing in front of the Academy, clutching an Oscar, while the world applauds your name. While other teenagers were stressing about math homework or weekend plans, Patty was being hailed as a once-in-a-generation talent. From there, her career soared. She was cast in The Patty Duke Show, a lighthearted sitcom where she played identical cousins, Patty and Kathy Lane. The series was clever, funny, and wholesome, exactly what American families in the 1960s loved to watch. It was a massive hit, turning Patty into a household name. To the public, she was charming, adorable, and endlessly entertaining. Audiences saw a bubbly teen living a dream life, adored by millions, but what they didn't see was the storm brewing behind the camera. From a very young age, Patty's life was controlled by her managers, John and Ethel Ross, who essentially became her guardians after her parents' marriage collapsed. But the Rosses weren't nurturing figures, they were exploiters. They micromanaged every aspect of her career and personal life, cutting her off from her family, overworking her, and even controlling what she ate. Patty would later confess that they treated her inappropriately, taking advantage of her in ways she was too young and too powerless to stop. In many ways, her childhood had been stolen. Fame wasn't a gift for Patty Duke, it was a prison dressed up in glamour. By the time she was winning awards and starring in hit TV shows, the cracks were already beginning to show. Patty struggled with extreme mood swings, soaring highs followed by devastating lows. She was unpredictable, sometimes euphoric and bursting with energy, other times spiraling into deep sadness and confusion. To outsiders, it looked like she was a typical Hollywood starlet struggling with pressure, but in reality, she was living with undiagnosed bipolar disorder, a condition few people understood in the 1960s. Mental health was a taboo subject, and instead of getting support, Patty was left to fend for herself. The fame machine demanded more performances, more appearances, more smiles for the camera, while inside she was breaking apart. As she moved from adolescence to adulthood, her personal life became just as turbulent as her inner world. Patty had a tendency to fall in love hard and fast. Her relationships were intense, impulsive, and often chaotic. One day she'd be passionately devoted to someone, and the next day it would all unravel in dramatic fashion. Some of her marriages and romances barely lasted more than a week, a pattern fueled by her manic episodes when she was full of restless energy and bold decisions. But when the moods shifted, the foundation crumbled. leaving heartbreak and confusion behind. This mix of stardom, exploitation, and mental health struggles shaped Patty into someone who lived on the edge, sometimes brilliant, sometimes broken, and always unpredictable. The world saw the sweet, relatable girl next door who had America laughing on TV screens, but behind closed doors she was often lost, trying to hold herself together in a life that felt out of control. This duality, fame and turmoil, triumph and chaos, became the backdrop for one of the most complicated family mysteries in Hollywood history. Because in 1971, when Patty Duke gave birth to her son, Sean, it wasn't just the beginning of a new life. It was the beginning of a question that would haunt her, her son, and the men around her for decades. Who was Sean's father? But before that mystery could unfold, Patty's story as America's sweetheart had already revealed a much darker truth. Sometimes the brightest lights hide the deepest shadows. And that shadow was about to stretch over her family in ways no one could have imagined. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Patty Duke's life had become a whirlwind of passion, unpredictability, and heartbreak. To outsiders, she was still the talented star who had won an Oscar and led a hit TV show. But behind the curtain, she was spiraling through highs and lows that no one around her could fully understand. Her bipolar disorder was undiagnosed at the time, which meant the people closest to her often mistook her manic episodes for eccentricity or wildness. When she was in those elevated states, she would throw herself into relationships with total abandon, falling in love hard and fast, sometimes within days. She married quickly, separated quickly, and lived in a constant cycle of intensity and collapse. This period of her life was marked by a string of romances and marriages that raised eyebrows in Hollywood. She seemed to have a pattern. When she was in a manic phase, she was impulsive, full of energy, and completely devoted to whoever caught her attention. But when the mood shifted, reality would crash in, and the relationship would crumble almost instantly. Friends and colleagues described her as someone who burned brightly but couldn't sustain the flame. By the early 1970s, this chaos reached a breaking point. Patty had entangled herself with three very different men in quick succession. One was Michael Tell, a music promoter who had briefly rented her apartment during one of her most unstable periods. Their relationship was little more than a fling, but in a haze of fear about public judgment and scandal, Patty shockingly married him in June 1970. The marriage lasted only 13 days before being annulled, a strange and impulsive decision even by Hollywood standards. Then there was Desi Arnaz Jr., the son of TV legends Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz Sr. Their romance was scandalous not only because of his fame, but also because of the age difference. Patty was in her early 20s, while Desi Jr. was still a teenager. Hollywood insiders whispered about the affair, and Lucille Ball herself reportedly tried to put an end to it. Despite the disapproval, Patty insisted that Desi Jr. was the love of her life, and for years she believed and told others that he was the father of her child. And then there was Sean Astin, the actor best known for playing Gomez Addams on The Addams Family. Unlike her other relationships, John brought a sense of stability and calm to her life. He was older, grounded, and kind, qualities Patty craved in the middle of her chaotic world. Though their marriage came later, John would eventually step in as the man who raised Sean, adopting him legally and giving him his last name. But back in 1971, when Patty gave birth to her son, the lines between these three men were blurred. Patty herself couldn't be certain who the father was. The timing of her relationships overlapped, her memory was foggy from her mental health struggles, and the pressure of Hollywood gossip made everything worse. The tabloids swarmed, speculating about the baby's father and treating Patty's deeply personal life as public entertainment. For most women, the birth of a child is a joyful moment. For Patty, it was the start of one of Hollywood's most enduring mysteries. She loved her son fiercely, but she carried the weight of uncertainty, guilt, and confusion about his paternity. And as Sean grew up, he would inherit that confusion too. To the world, Patty Duke was still America's sweetheart, but in her private life, she was a young mother caught in a storm of scandal, secrecy, and unanswered questions. She couldn't give her son clarity because she didn't have it herself. Instead, she clung to the narratives that felt true in the moment, sometimes insisting Sean Astin was the father, other times Desi Arnaz Jr. Her certainty shifted as her moods did, and Sean was left to navigate a childhood shadowed by half-truths. This period defined not just Patty's personal story, but also Sean's. His earliest years were shaped by a mystery that even his mother couldn't solve. And while he would go on to find success in Hollywood on his own terms, the unanswered question of who his real father was lingered in the background. It was a question that no amount of fame, no number of movie roles could quiet. But before Sean could face that truth, the world had to meet the three men who would each play a role in his extraordinary story. From the very beginning, Sean Astin's life was wrapped in a mystery with three men at the center of it, each connected to his mother, Patty Duke, in very different ways. The first was Michael Tell, a man most people had never even heard of at the time. He wasn't an actor, he was a Hollywood star, and he had no glamorous reputation. He was a writer and a music promoter, someone who worked behind the scenes in the entertainment world. Michael entered Patty's life during one of her most unstable periods. She had been renting out her apartment, and Michael was the tenant. Somehow, their paths crossed in a brief and confusing fling. It wasn't love, it wasn't commitment, and in truth, it wasn't much of a relationship at all. But in June of 1970, Patty shocked everyone by marrying him in a civil ceremony. There was no glamour, no honeymoon, no fairy tale romance, just a quick and impulsive decision that baffled her friends and left Hollywood buzzing. 13 days later, the marriage was annulled. Patty herself dismissed the union as a mistake, claiming it was never consummated, and she insisted Michael could not possibly be the father of her child. For decades, she all but erased him from the story, telling both the press and her son that he wasn't in the picture. To her, Michael Tell was a ghost from the past, a name on a piece of paper, nothing more. But as history would show, the truth had a way of circling back. Then there was Dacey Arnaz Jr., the young man who seemed the most likely candidate for years. Dacey Jr. was Hollywood royalty, the son of Lucille Ball and Dacey Arnaz Sr., and he carried the weight of that famous last name. When he and Patty became involved, it caused a media storm. He was still a teenager, while she was in her 20s, and the scandal of their romance made headlines. Rumors swirled that Lucille Ball was furious, seeing Patty as reckless and unstable and doing everything in her power to separate them. But Patty was smitten, convinced that Dacey Jr. was the man she loved and later the father of her child. She told Sean this story repeatedly throughout his childhood, that Dacey Jr. was his biological father. And for a long time, Sean believed it. After all, it made sense on paper. The timing of their relationship lined up, and Dacey Jr.'s public silence left room for interpretation. He never publicly denied it, but he never fully claimed Sean either. He stayed in the shadows, letting the rumors swirl, leaving Sean to grow up with a sense of half-connection to one of Hollywood's most famous families. Finally, there was John Astin, the man who would end up shaping Sean's life more than anyone else. John was already known to millions as Gomez Addams from the Addams Family. He was an established actor, but more importantly, he was steady, calm, and grounded, the exact opposite of the chaos that defined Patty's world. By the mid-1970s, Patty and John were married, and John adopted Sean as his own son. He gave him his last name, raised him as part of his family, and became the father figure Sean desperately needed. Together, Patty and John had another son, Mackenzie, who also went on to act, creating a family unit that, for a while at least, felt stable and loving. To Sean, John was dad, not just emotionally, but in every way that mattered. But here, where things grew even more complicated, Patty's version of the truth was never consistent. Sometimes she insisted John was Sean's real father. Other times she switched her story and told Sean that Dacey Jr. was the one. Occasionally, she would dismiss both men entirely. To outsiders, it seemed like she was being evasive or even manipulative. But to those who knew her best, it was clear her shifting answers were the result of her bipolar disorder, her fractured memory, and the trauma of those chaotic years. She wasn't lying as much as she was lost, trapped in a haze of her own uncertainty. For Sean, this was devastating. Imagine being a child, asking your mother the most basic question about who you are, and never getting the same answer twice. He adored John Astin, and he respected Dacey Arnaz Jr., but he couldn't shake the doubt in his heart. The confusion only deepened when, years later, he met a relative of Michael Tell who suggested they might actually be related. This random encounter planted a seed in Sean's mind that would eventually push him to take action. By the time he was an adult, the whispers had grown too loud, the inconsistencies too overwhelming. Sean realized that if he wanted answers, he would have to find them himself. The three men, Michael Tell, Dacey Arnaz Jr., and Sean Astin, had each played a role in his life story, but only one of them carried the truth in his DNA. And when Sean finally decided to uncover that truth, it set the stage for one of the most surprising revelations in Hollywood history. Sean Astin may have been born into chaos, but he grew up determined to carve out his own place in Hollywood. From an early age, it was clear he had inherited his mother's talent, but unlike Patty Duke, his path wasn't marked by overnight stardom or sudden fame. Instead, Sean built his career slowly, brick by brick, avoiding the pitfalls that destroyed so many other child actors. His breakout role came in 1985 with the Goonies. Playing Mikey, the adventurous kid with a heart of gold, Sean captured the imagination of an entire generation. While other young stars from the film faded into obscurity or burned out, Sean managed to stay grounded, treating the role not as his peak, but as the start of something bigger. He continued acting through his teens and 20s, steadily stacking credits without ever getting trapped in the typical child star narrative. Unlike many who struggled with fame at a young age, Sean approached Hollywood with patience and resilience, qualities that kept him in the industry for decades. What truly set him apart came years later with his role in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. When Peter Jackson announced the films, the spotlight immediately fell on big names like Elijah Wood, Viggo Mortensen, and Ian McKellen. But as the story unfolded, it was Sean's portrayal of Samwise Gamgee that stole the hearts of audiences worldwide. Sam wasn't the flashy hero, the warrior, or the chosen one. He was the loyal friend who carried the true emotional weight of the journey. Sean's performance was deeply human, filled with sincerity and quiet strength, and it earned him recognition as one of the trilogy's emotional anchors. Millions of viewers saw in Sam the embodiment of loyalty and courage, and through that character, Sean cemented his legacy in film history. Yet acting wasn't his only passion. In the 1990s, Sean stepped behind the camera, directing and co-producing a short film called Kangaroo Court. The project was a surprise success, earning an Academy Award nomination for Best Live-Action Short Film in 1995. It was proof that Sean wasn't just another actor riding on his mother's fame. He was an artist with vision and range. He continued to take on diverse roles, from comedies to dramas, never allowing himself to be boxed into one category. Then, decades after the Goonies, Sean resurfaced in yet another cultural phenomenon, Stranger Things. His role as Bob Newby, the lovable and nerdy boyfriend, once again reminded audiences why he stood out. Sean had a gift for playing characters who felt real, relatable, and deeply human, and once again he stole the show, despite sharing the screen with an ensemble cast. But behind the applause and recognition, Sean carried a question that fame couldn't erase. No matter how many roles he played or how much success he achieved, he couldn't shake the uncertainty that had followed him since childhood. Who was his real father? He had grown up believing different stories at different times. For years, he thought Dacey Arnaz Jr. was his father because that's what his mother told him. At other times, he believed Sean Astin was the one because John had been the man who raised him, cared for him, and given him his last name. And then there were the whispers about Michael Tell, the man Patty had married for 13 days and dismissed as irrelevant. Each version of the story left Sean with pieces of the truth, but never the full picture. He loved John deeply, he respected Dacey, and he knew little about Michael, but the not knowing gnawed at him. As he matured, the desire for clarity grew stronger. For Sean, this wasn't about scandal or tabloid fodder, it was about identity. It was about answering a question that had shaped his life for decades. By the time he was an adult with children of his own, he realized that he needed to know, once and for all, the truth about his origins. That decision would push him to take a step that would not only redefine his own life, but also rewrite one of Hollywood's longest-standing mysteries. And when he finally made that choice, the answers he uncovered would shock everyone, including himself. When Sean Astin finally decided to confront the mystery of his paternity, it wasn't a decision made lightly. For most of his life, he had accepted the stories his mother told him, even when they changed from year to year. He believed Dacey Arnaz Jr. was his father because Patty had told him so, and the timing seemed to fit. Later, he leaned on Sean Astin as both his emotional and legal father, never questioning the bond they shared. But as he got older, the whispers about Michael Tell resurfaced, and a chance meeting with one of Michael's relatives planted seeds of doubt he could no longer ignore. For Sean, the choice to seek the truth wasn't about resentment or betrayal. It was about closure, about finally answering a question that had haunted him since childhood. He approached it with maturity and respect, reaching out to the three men whose lives were intertwined with his own. Remarkably, each one, Sean Astin, Daisy Arnaz Jr., and Michael Tell, agreed to cooperate with a DNA test. This in itself was extraordinary. Each man had something to lose, whether it was reputation, privacy, or even the emotional connection to Sean. Yet they all understood the weight of the situation, and they all stepped up. The waiting period after the test was excruciating. Days felt like weeks, each moment heavy with possibility. What if the results upended everything Sean believed about his family? What if they shattered the bond he shared with Sean Astin, the man he had always called Dad? What if the truth left him with more questions than answers? For Sean, this was more than just science, it was a reckoning with his own identity. When the results finally arrived, they carried a revelation that stunned him. The man he had spent the least time thinking about, the one his mother had dismissed for decades, turned out to be his biological father. Michael Tell, the music promoter Patty had married in a panicked 13-day union, was the man whose DNA matched Sean's. The discovery was both shocking and oddly grounding. After years of uncertainty, Sean finally had a definitive answer, yet his response wasn't anger, bitterness, or even sadness. Instead, it was a calm acceptance. He didn't see the truth as a rejection of Sean Astin or even of Daisy Arnaz Jr. He saw it as an expansion of his story, a missing piece finally clicking into place. In interviews, Sean later explained it simply. "If you want to know who I am, Sean Astin is my father and Michael Tell is my biological father." It was a profound way of separating biology from love, science from parenthood. For Sean, the DNA didn't undo the years of love, guidance, and fatherhood that Sean Astin had given him. If anything, it made that bond even more powerful, because now he understood the difference between being a dad by blood and being a dad by choice. The fallout from the revelation didn't stop with Sean, though. Patty Duke herself struggled to accept the results. Even after the DNA evidence was undeniable, she continued to insist that Michael Tell could not possibly be the father. She clung to her version of events, saying that her marriage to Michael had never been consummated. In one interview, she even went so far as to say, "I don't buy that test. I know what I know to be true." For Patty, it wasn't about facts. It was about the memories she had, however clouded by her struggles with bipolar disorder and the chaos of that time. She wasn't trying to lie. She was trying to reconcile decades of pain, instability, and choices she herself didn't fully understand. Despite this, Sean never turned his back on his mother. He accepted her resistance with compassion, recognizing that her illness and trauma shaped her perspective. For him, the DNA results weren't a weapon, they were simply the truth. And even though Patty couldn't accept them, Sean used them to build peace in his own life. What could have been a divisive, explosive revelation instead became an opportunity for healing. Sean didn't lash out, and he didn't push anyone away. Instead, he chose to embrace the truth with grace. His relationship with Michael Tell began quietly, without fanfare or tabloid spectacle. Michael had lived a private life, far removed from Hollywood's glare, but when Sean reached out, he welcomed him with humility. He didn't resist the results or deny responsibility. He simply acknowledged Sean and let the bond form naturally. For Sean, this wasn't about rewriting the past, it was about completing the puzzle. He could now honor Sean as the father who raised him, respect Daisy as a chapter in his story, and accept Michael as his biological connection. It was a rare example of a Hollywood scandal ending not in bitterness, but in clarity and reconciliation. The DNA test may have shocked the world, but for Sean Astin, it brought something he had been searching for his entire life: peace with who he was, where he came from, and the men who shaped him. And in that acceptance, he found the freedom to move forward with a full understanding of his identity. But what truly set Sean apart wasn't just his ability to accept the truth, it was the way he redefined fatherhood in the process. For him, it wasn't about choosing one man over another. It was about recognizing the different ways each had influenced his life and embracing all of them as part of his story. That perspective would become the foundation of the way he spoke about family for the rest of his life. For Sean Astin, the revelation of his biological father could have been the ending to a painful story, but instead it became the beginning of something far more profound. Most people would expect such a discovery to cause division, bitterness, or even rejection, but Sean's response was the opposite. He chose to see his life not as a fractured story, but as one that was uniquely whole. He began openly acknowledging what many people found difficult to grasp, that he had three fathers, each of whom shaped him in different but equally important ways. To Sean, John Astin was never in question. John was the man who tucked him in at night, showed up for school plays, guided him through adolescence, and modeled what it meant to be a decent, grounded human being. He had given Sean his name, his time, and his unconditional love. For Sean, those things mattered more than any DNA test ever could. In interviews, he spoke of John with reverence, calling him not just a father figure, but truly his dad in every sense of the word. At the same time, Sean was careful not to dismiss Daisy Arna's Jr. While they never developed a deep father-son relationship, Sean looked back on that chapter with empathy rather than resentment. He understood that Daisy was a teenager caught in a media firestorm, and that the weight of Hollywood gossip had made a complicated situation even more difficult. Rather than dwell on what might have been, Sean chose to accept that Daisy's role in his story was simply part of the larger puzzle. The most surprising relationship was the one that formed with Michael Tell. After the DNA results confirmed him as Sean's biological father, there was no dramatic confrontation, no resentment for decades of absence. Instead, their connection grew quietly, built on mutual respect and a willingness to accept what the truth revealed. Michael had never sought the spotlight and continued to live privately, but he welcomed Sean into his life with humility. He didn't try to rewrite history or claim credit for raising him. Instead, he offered Sean a chance to know him as a person, not as a headline. Sean responded with the same openness. He didn't approach Michael as a stranger who had suddenly become important. He approached him as a missing piece of his identity, someone who could help him understand himself in a new way. Their relationship wasn't about replacing John Astin or minimizing Daisy. It was about adding another layer to the understanding of who Sean was. What made Sean's approach so powerful was his ability to hold space for all three men without conflict. Where others might have chosen one father and rejected the rest, Sean embraced them all, each in their own role. He often said that biology may determine where you come from, but it doesn't determine who your father is. For him, fatherhood was defined by love, guidance, and presence, not just blood. This perspective became a reflection of the way he approached life itself, grounded, compassionate, and resilient. It also shaped the way he remembered his mother. Patty Duke may have struggled with mental illness and personal chaos, but Sean never let those struggles define her in his heart. After her passing in 2016, he described her as a warrior, a woman who fought through unimaginable circumstances with a strength that inspired him. He even established the Patty Duke Mental Health Initiative in her honor, turning her pain into advocacy for others. In the end, Sean's story wasn't just about uncovering a long-hidden truth. It was about redefining what family really means. He was a man raised by love, shaped by three very different fathers, and guided by a mother whose life was both brilliant and troubled. Instead of letting the scandal define him, he allowed it to inform him, using it as proof that family isn't limited to neat definitions or perfect stories. Family, in Sean's eyes, is connection, choice, and the courage to embrace every part of your story, even the messy ones. For the millions who know him as Samwise Gamgee, Sean Astin's real-life journey carries the same lesson his character taught on screen. Loyalty, love, and resilience are what carry us through. And as he himself has shown, sometimes the truth doesn't tear a family apart, it makes it whole. The question that once haunted Sean Astin for decades finally had an answer, but in the end, the real revelation was this: family isn't about DNA. It's about who shows up, who stays, and who loves you without condition. Would you want to know the truth if it meant rewriting everything you thought you knew about yourself?